Hey, it's Joel Mark Witt for Personality Hacker. In my last video, I talked about emotions. I said that emotions are your responsibility. I talked about moving out of a negative emotion into a positive emotion. I gave an exercise for that. I got some pushback. People said two things. Number one, all emotions are valid, Joel. Why are you classifying emotions as negative or positive? They're all just emotions. We as humans need to feel every part of the emotional experience. So by you classifying emotions into positive and negative, you're removing the ability from people to feel what they need to feel. You're removing the ability for people that need to feel maybe a negative emotion in a proper circumstance. And I would say, first of all, that I agree with you. All emotions are valid ultimately. All emotions come up for us for a reason. But it would be like saying all pain is valid in my body. I feel pain in my arm and oh, that's valid. I should feel this pain because hurt is part of the human experience. I have an arm that hurts, my arm hurts. Well, that gives me a pain point to put attention to my body saying, hey Joel, there's something wrong with your arm, go get it checked out. I am appreciative of the pain in my arm because it lets me know there's a challenge, there's a problem. Now, what if I wanted to live my entire life in excruciating pain in my arm? Would that be a healthy life that I'd be leading? Would it be healthy for me to go around every day feeling pain in my arm? And when somebody goes, well, dude, just go get that checked out. I mean, it doesn't sound like that's serving you very well. And I say, no, all pain is valid. All pain deserves to be felt in my body. And I don't want to go get it fixed because I feel like I'd be betraying the true essence of pain showing up in my life. How ridiculous would that be? Emotions can work the same way. Contextually, pain is useful for me. When I feel pain in my body, it's useful for me to get something fixed. Emotions can be the same way. Now, emotions are even more complex than pain. Emotions can be a way to work out issues, solve challenges in your life, work through difficulties, work through healing in your life. There's all sorts of reasons why quote unquote negative or bad emotions might come up and might be useful in your life as a person. For example, the emotion of stress might be useful. When I'm in an environment where I need to feel stressed, it keeps me attuned, it keeps me focused. Our ancestors dealt with this. They felt the emotion of stress when they're on the Serengeti and they're being chased by a lion or some other predator. They feel the emotion of stress in order to run and flee from that predator. But what happens in the modern world when I'm ready to give a speech on stage and I feel an overwhelming, crippling sense of stress that comes from an emotion that used to serve my ancestors? It doesn't serve me to feel stressed in that environment because now it's distracting me from what I'm trying to accomplish in the here and now. That's just a basic example of context mattering for the exact same emotion that serves you in one context but doesn't serve you in the other. So I would agree, emotions are for the most part neutral. There is no bad or positive emotions, but some emotions can lead to long-term health and some emotions can lead to long-term damage or actually lead to your death earlier than you might want. The second pushback I got in the last video was when I made the statement that no one can make you feel an emotion you don't want to feel. And this one, even more than emotions not being valid, this one got a lot of pushback. A lot of people really had a difficult time with this notion that you are ultimately in control of your own emotions and no one can make you feel anything. When I say that no one can make you feel an emotion, what I'm actually saying is ultimately there is no such thing as cause and effect. I mean, really, that's really what I'm saying. And so in order to explain what I mean by no one being able to make you feel an emotion, I need to explain how I think about the world at this point. I think in terms of systems. There is no such thing as cause creating effect. There are emergent properties of systems running. So if I feel an emotion, it's not one thing that made me feel an emotion. There's a bunch of nodes in a system running that bring out that emotion as the inevitable emergent of that system. At the very base level, we talk about emotions first and foremost. However, we give emotions labels. Let's say I feel the emotion of anger. I don't actually feel the emotion of anger. There is no such thing as the emotion of anger. There is a complex emotional response that I have labeled anger. I've just labeled it that. And you have a complex emotional response in your life that you have also labeled anger, quote unquote. Your complex emotional response is not going to be the same complex emotional response that I have, that we've both labeled anger. We have the exact same label, but inside of us, it's a very different response happening. Our behavior might seem to the outside observer that we are both angry and we're expressing it in similar ways. But under the surface, we know this as people that none of us have the exact same experience. I have a whole range of systems in my life that have been running up until now, that when I have the expression of anger, there are much more nuanced, complex emotional responses that go into that than just the label of anger. It may be mixed with a little bit of sadness in one situation, mixed with a little bit of resentment in another situation. It can't just be called anger across the board in all contexts when I might exhibit these emotional responses. And you also, your entire life, have had different influencers running that have gotten you to the place where when you say you feel angry, it's a complex emotional response that's mixed with other feelings and thoughts and other things coming up for you that you've labeled anger. So when we talk about emotions that we give labels to, we're not even talking about the same thing. Your anger is different than my anger. And that's at the baseline level. Already, it would be very difficult for me to reach into you and make you feel anger, whatever that is, because I've given a label that means something very specific to me. How am I going to reach into you, into your heart, into your mind, and make you feel what you've classified as anger, which is so subjective and so specific to you and the experiences you've had in your life? How would I be able to do that? So that's just at the baseline level. Take that a level further. Take it one level up. The narratives and stories we tell ourselves about what's happening in the world. We already have preconceived ideas. We have narratives running in our heads of making meaning of all the stimuli that happens. So we walk through the world, we hear things, touch things, taste things, feel things, smell things, and we construct stories from those experiences. So I walk into a funeral and I construct a story about what that funeral means for me. Maybe my grandfather passed away, and I have a very robust story about my grandfather and how the story of my grandfather's life, his interaction with me, how we, had relationship together, what I think about him, the things he taught me. I've got an entire narrative running around my grandfather and his passing away. Let's say you come to that funeral with me and you met my grandfather one time. So you know him, you've had a conversation with my grandfather, but you didn't grow up with him. He wasn't in your life on a every other day basis. You never really hung out with him. You just met him one time. You might feel a little sadness because someone in the world has died, has passed away. But your narrative might relate your sadness back to someone who you've lost in your life. So we have quote unquote sadness come up for us, which we've just talked about can't actually be the same sadness because you have a complex emotional response when you label sadness, and I have a complex emotional response when I label sadness. And our narratives that go along with that sadness are different. Mine is much more personal to my grandfather. Yours is probably personal to someone else in your life you've lost that my grandfather reminds you of. So our narratives now are drastically different. And let's just add one more node to the system. Let's go ahead and add the node of the stimuli itself. All things being equal, in other words, all the stimuli in the outside world, a bird chirp, let's just assume a bird chirp is 10 decibels, or whatever, let's just give it a number, 10, units of 10 measurement. Well, how do we know that your ears, when you hear a bird sound, are also the same frequency or same receptor as my ears? Let's say it's a unit of 10, take decibels out of it, just whatever unit of 10 of measurement for a bird chirping. You can hear some chirping in the background right now. You hear that and you give it a unit of maybe, and your perceptive, response in your own mind is that's about an 8 on my scale, whatever your scale is, your subjective scale of hearing a bird chirp, and I give it a 10. So the stimuli itself, my ears are not your ears. I'm going to be literally hearing things differently than you're going to hear. We may have some consensus around, oh yeah, I've labeled that chirping noise, I've given it a narrative and a label that that's a bird. And Joel, you've given a label that that's also a bird. And so when we hear that chirping noise, we both agree, we have consensus that that's a bird noise, and we can, create a shared narrative around that. But it's not the exact same noise from my ears to your ears. And we know that from people that have hearing loss, they can still hear things. They're not hearing it the same way you hear it. So I just talked about 3 nodes in a system that lead to emotions. You have the emotions themselves, like the actual emotional experience, which we all have a label for, but it is a complex response coming from us. Your complex response of sadness, whatever you've labeled sadness, is not going to be my complex response that I've labeled sadness. So those are already different. Then we have the narratives that help us make meaning around the sadness we're feeling. And we just illustrated that those are not going to necessarily be the same. Those are going to be different narratives. And then we have the stimuli, the actual physical stimulus that creates our perceptions. We hear and see and taste things, and even those aren't going to be the same. So your taste is different than mine, your hearing is different than mine. Those are different. And those are just 3 nodes. There's multiple other systems running. There are impressions you build over time, there's your history, there's all the other narratives, like meta-narratives you have running over top of the specific narrative. There's how, your physicality, how much water you had that day. Did you have enough vitamin D? Like there's all sorts of other internal processes happening too we didn't even talk about, right? And other external processes happening as well. So if I want to make you feel sadness, I would have to first know exactly how you label sadness. In other words, you give me this label of sadness. You made me feel sad. In order for me to make you feel sad, I'd have to know, how do you label sadness? There's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of minute, tiny little emotional complex responses that come up for you that are mixed and blended together in a very nuanced way that come up in your heart, that you then say, oh, I'm feeling the emotion of sadness, right? And for me to make you feel sad, I'd have to know all of those little nuances inside of you in order to know how you've labeled sadness. Then I would have to know all of the ways that you construct narratives, how you construct narratives, and how you think about narratives. Do you have meta-narratives running? Do you have multiple narratives running? And I would have to know exactly how your mind constructs narratives for itself, and I'd have to be able to write to those narratives that would help contribute to the nodes in the system that would emerge the thing you've labeled as sadness. So first of all, I'm talking about the emotion. Second of all, I'd have to know all of the narratives. And then I would have to know all of the stimuli responses. How does your body respond to noise, to taste, to smell, to all the things that stimulate, like the stimulus that comes into you? I'd have to know in a minute detail all of the nuances of that. How do you process stimuli? So if you came to me and said, you made me feel sad, what you're actually saying is, Joel, you understood every single possible node, and there's probably thousands of them that give you the emergence of what you've labeled as sadness. I would have to know all of those nodes and be able to also have complete and total manipulation of all those nodes in that system to help create sadness in your experience. When I say that you have control over your emotions, no one can make you feel an emotion you don't want to feel. What I mean is there is no such thing as a cause and then an emotional effect. Emotions, just like everything in life is an emergent property of an entire system running. Some parts of those systems are known, some parts of those systems are unknown, but what we as humans need to do is take control of as many nodes in the system that we can control, influence those new nodes, which then lead us to a new emergent from that system. You want to feel positive emotions, find out which nodes in the system are controllable for you. I think one of the nodes in the system, one of the best nodes to start with, start taking control of the narratives, the stories you tell yourself about what's happening. So, to review, nothing is cause and effect. Everything is an emergent property of a system, including emotions. No one can influence all the nodes in a system to give you the emergent of the emotional cluster you've labeled whatever you've labeled it. Ultimately, you have the most control in that situation because you control the narrative. You control the connection of the narrative to the emotion cluster itself that you've given a label. And in fact, the label you've given that emotional cluster isn't the same as anyone else's label they've given their complex emotional cluster. So no one can make you feel an emotion just by definition because they're not the same thing for two different people. So by the subjective nature of emotions, it's impossible at the base level. And then it just, from there, the impossibilities keep going further and further. Hopefully this gives you some clarity. When I say no one can make you feel an emotion, this is what I mean. No one can make all these things work together in concert to create that inevitable emergent. It's just beyond one person's ability. You'd have to have godlike powers to be able to do that. Leave a comment, ask a question below this video. I'd love to have more discussion, more conversation around this. And I like this idea of exploring emotions together and narratives that lead us to emotions together. This is one of the things that has changed my life more than anything else. Being able to take control of how I think about things, the stories I tell myself, and ultimately the emergent, complex emotional responses that come up for me. It's exciting when you get down to the level of being able to do this. My name is Joel Mark Witt for Personality Hacker. I'll talk with you on the next video.